I always tell everyone, don't clap. You haven't heard me talk yet. But that was great. Patrick, thank you. Let me thank FRC Action and all the groups sponsoring today's event. And I had a chance to meet Carrie and Stacy backstage. They weren't they just phenomenal? I mean, it's I just want to start here. It's still the greatest country in the world, isn't it? And we always need to remember that. The greatest nation in history is the United States of America. I've had the opportunity, my background's actually in the sport of wrestling. I've had the opportunity through wrestling to travel. I was in the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. I've been to Cuba a couple times. And I tell folks, you know, you go places like that, you thank the good Lord you live here. You really do. I tell people, I was in Moscow in February. Now, Moscow in February, it's like 400 below zero. I mean, you really thank the good Lord you live here, but it is a great. So we should be positive. I tell groups all the time. Look, Pence has the best line. He says I'm a conservative and I'm not mad about it. I mean that's got to be that's the approach, and you all know this too. I love this the old story from Scripture. You know, when the Philistines were camped against the Israelites every day, the Philistine giant. You all know this one. Walk out, issue the challenge: who will fight Goliath? And the Israelites' response was, he's so big we can never defeat him. But David's response was, he's so big I can't miss. I mean, that's the attitude we need at this critical moment in our nation's history. And if we're going to make sure, if we're going to make sure that we continue to be the greatest nation in history, there are certain values, certain principles that need defending, protecting, and promoting. And I share this story all the time, but I've yet to hear someone capture those basic concepts and truths in such a succinct way as Scott O'Grady did. How many remember the story? Scott O'Grady, shot down, had to survive, was rescued. Amazing story, amazing story. When he was brought to safety and interviewed, and the press had the microphones all in front of him, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was amazing what this young man had to say after going through this amazing experience. He said, first of all, I want to thank God. He said, it's a miracle I'm standing here. He said, second, and I'm definitely paraphrasing, but he said something to this effect. He said, I want to thank my family. He said, it was while I was out there doing what I had to do to make it, that I thought about them. I knew they were thinking and praying for me. Knowing they were doing all that helped motivate me to do what I had to do to make it. He said, I want to thank my family. And then he said, third, I want to thank the folks who rescued me. They're the heroes. They put their lives on the line to come save me. And I thought, you know what? Here's a guy, a young man, who has captured what makes America the greatest nation ever, who's captured what life's all about. When he referenced God, he was getting at this idea of faith and how central it's been to the American experience. When he talked about family, he talked about the key institution in our culture. The institution, I would argue, ultimately determines the strength of our entire society. And then when he talked about his fellow servicemen, he was getting at the word we most associate with this country, and that's freedom. Because in this country, the United States military has always stood for freedom. And that's unusual. That is really unusual. Throughout most of history, militaries have stood for tyranny and oppression, but the United States military has always represented freedom, not just for Americans, but for countless number of people around the planet. Faith, family, and freedom. And when you think about it, that's really what it's about. Those three things. Faith is the most important. You think about it on a personal level, and you all know this, a relationship with the God of the universe through what he did with his son when he came, bled, died, rose again. That is the most important thing on a personal level. We all understand that. But in the bigger picture, in the aggregate sense, faith as being part of the public square has always been central to the American experience. The good folks who started this place and put it all on the line, their lives, their fortune, their sacred honor, to start a place where freedom really mattered, they understood the importance of faith in maintaining freedom. They got it. And we have to make sure that faith is never driven from the public square. That's why you're all here. And that's the central thing. And then family. As I said, you think about the institutions the good Lord put together. It wasn't the church. It wasn't the state. The first institution was the family. And the strength of that, and policymakers need to keep this in mind. People ask me all the time, Jordan, why are you always looking to cut taxes? And it's because I'd rather have moms and dads keep more of their money than send it to Washington, D.C. It's a pretty simple concept, right? Polly, we were talking backstage, and the two young ladies who did such a great job singing, they were asking about our family, and said, I've known my wife since grade school. Polly and I have been married 26 years. We have 4 kids. And the one thing we have learned is the older we get, the more we appreciate our parents. It's funny how that works, you know? It really, we have 4, as I said, Rachel, Benjamin, Jesse, and Isaac, and it's amazing as I've told folks before, parenting is the most intimidating task I've ever undertaken, but it's also the most rewarding. And there's just something about that family relationship and how you appreciate, as I said, your parents over time. I love you may have heard this, Mark Twain had a way of capturing important concepts in a humorous way, but he made a great line when he was talking about his relationship with his dad and how that evolved and changed over time. He said, when I was 10 years old, my dad knew everything. When I was 20, he didn't know much of anything. And now that I'm 30, I'm surprised at how much he's learned in 10 years. And that's sort of the way it works. But one of the hallmarks of this great country is the strength of that institution and moms and dads making sacrifices so that their kids can grow up and have life a little better than they did. And then they, in turn, do it for their children, and they have life a little better than they did, more opportunities, more chances to excel and succeed and chase their goals and their dreams. And then they do it for the next, and we get this wonderful thing we call America because parents make sacrifices for their kids. I told you earlier my background is in wrestling, and I used to work for my brother at his wrestling camp. And he has hundreds of kids, actually over 1,000 kids come to his camp. And many times a youngster would walk up to me and they'll say, when I was working there, they say, Coach, what's the biggest win in your wrestling career? And I've been fortunate. Wrestling's been great to our family. As I said, I've got to travel all over the place, compete all over the country, compete in, as I said, Soviet Union, Cuba. All kinds of neat experiences in wrestling. But I can honestly tell that young man when he asked, what was the biggest win in your career? Came back when I was a 15-year-old kid in Ohio wrestling for the state championship. And I tell people I won mostly because of my dad. When I really think about it, I won mostly because I was ignorant. You see, I didn't know that kids from Southwest Ohio weren't supposed to beat those kids from Cleveland and Akron and Canton where wrestling was big. I didn't know that some freshman wasn't supposed to win. I didn't know that some country boy from Graham High School wasn't supposed to win. All I knew is what my dad told me. And he said, if you set goals and you work hard, good things can happen. And I was dumb enough to believe him. But the point is, he did what parents have done all the time. He invested time in me. He kicked me in the tail he did what parents are supposed to do. And because of that, I got to experience neat things in the sport of wrestling. And because of those, I think those values you get from your parents, you get to go after all kinds of goals and dreams and actually sometimes accomplish them. So we've got to make sure we keep in mind the key importance of that institution as we develop policy in this country and rewarding it and recognizing that it ultimately determines the strength of our entire culture. And then finally, Scott O'Grady got at this idea of freedom when he referenced the military. And freedom is nothing more than the ability to set goals, to have dreams, and to chase them down. And you can do it in this country more than any other place in history. And we need to keep that in mind. It is a really basic concept. The bigger government gets, the less your freedom, the less opportunities you have to truly accomplish what you want to accomplish, what has meaning to you and your family. It's one of the reasons, you think about this, and I didn't want to get into a whole lot of policy, but you think about the health care legislation, the Obamacare legislation that passed, and why Americans so dislike it. It's not really just about the numbers and all the pages. When you boil it all down, Americans dislike it because we're Americans and we hate being told what to do. It's just part of our DNA. You think about the folks who came here. They said, in Europe, they said, you're going to have to practice your faith a certain way. They said, no, we're not. And we're willing to get in a boat, go across the ocean, and do it the way we think the good Lord wants us to. And then they got here in Great Britain and said, we're going to tax you. You're not going to get much representation of any. And they said, we don't particularly like that arrangement, and we're willing to fight to overturn it. And we're willing to, before we fight, declare to the world why it's wrong that you're doing that to us in the first place. I mean, Americans don't like being told what to do. And here comes the federal government with a couple thousand-page bill saying we're going to put bureaucrats between you and your doctor, and Americans say, no, you're not. I mean, you all know the old joke. For most Americans, we hate being told what to do. For most Americans, when we're traveling down the highway and we see the sign that says 55, for most Americans, that's not the limit. That's the challenge, right? That's how we look at things. Our task is real simple: to protect the promise that these principles truly offer its citizens. I mean, you think about the promise that the founders envisioned this nation would offer its citizens when they put on paper in the document that started it all, And I tell folks, next to Scripture, the best words ever put on paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, pursuit. They stated for the world the foundation in a visionary, romantic type language they use to capture what this country would, in fact, offer to its citizens. And our job is to protect that. And the challenge is real basic. I love my favorite Scripture verse, 2 Timothy 4:7. Fought the good fight, finished the course, kept the faith. And I love that verse because of the action that's in it. It's a verse that fits America. We've always been a people that said, let's fight the fight, let's finish the course, let's keep the faith. We're a country, we're a people of action. And particularly when it comes to defending the core concepts that make us great in the first place. That's our charge as we go forward. And there's two things you have to do if you're ever going to accomplish something that really matters. It's never easy, I understand that. To accomplish anything that really counts, it's always hard. You got to have discipline, and you got to be willing to take the risk associated with it. I mean, I tell this story all the time. Our staff has heard me talk about it, but it had a huge impact on me. My high school wrestling coach was the chemistry and physics teacher at our high school. Toughest teacher in the school, toughest wrestling coach in the state. And this is not an exaggeration. He talked about discipline every day. He said, Jordan, in his classroom, he said, Jordan, this is chemistry. It's not just any old class. You want to do well in my class? You better prepare the night before. You better be reading the assignments. You better participate when you come to class. It's going to take discipline to do well in this class. And in the wrestling room, it was ridiculous. Every stinking day, he talked about discipline. And it drove me nuts because he sounded like my dad. I said, I get it from my dad all day at home. Now I get it from my coach. But he would say, and I can hear it in my head today. The most important character quality necessary to accomplish anything of meaning or significance is self-discipline. You got to have self-discipline. Every day I was like, well, that guy, be quiet. But he had a great definition. Coach McCunn passed away a couple years ago. Super guy. Had a great definition that hangs in our wrestling room today. He said, discipline's doing what you don't want to do when you don't want to do it. And basically that meant doing things Coach's way when you'd rather do them your way. It meant doing things the right way when you'd rather do them the convenient way. And the one thing I know about this town, I've only been here 5 years, it's always about doing the convenient thing. Almost every single time. They put a deal together, kick the can. We're at a point in history where we can no longer do the convenient thing, whether it's about fiscal policy, whether it's about tax policy, whether it's about protecting these values we're talking about here at this conference, whatever it is, it's not about doing the convenient thing. It's about doing the disciplined thing, which is almost always the right thing, just the way it works. Let me just finish with one other quick story. When you decide to engage in fighting the fight and finishing the course and keeping the faith, when you decide to do that, you got to have discipline, but you got to understand there's going to be risk associated with doing that. Anything you try to do that's worthwhile, there's risk associated with it. Just the way, let's just be honest. The press doesn't necessarily say good things about us, do they? I mean, you know that's going to be part of it. Y'all know y'all read Cal Thomas, right? He has a great line when he's talking about the elite national press. He has a great line. He's talking about the difference between the way they kind of see things and the way a lot of Americans see things. And his line is, he says, I get up every morning, I read my Bible and the New York Times so I can see what each side's up to. Yeah, so just understand that from the start. It's not always going to be fair. People are going to say bad things about you. It happens to me all the time. But that's just part of it. And it's still worth the risk to get involved because you're trying to do the right things. And I'll finish here. How many of you have ever seen the movie Chariots of Fire? I love this story. Made our kids, the movie's way back when I was a kid, and I make our kids watch it. Storyline is you follow a handful of British athletes, 5, in the early 1920s as they're getting ready to compete in the 1924 Paris Olympic Games in the sport of track and field. And you really focus in on 2 in particular, Harold Abrahams and Eric Liddell. Both interesting guys. Both wind up being Olympic gold medalists. One in the 100-meter dash, one in the open 400. Both super. Liddell goes on to be a missionary to China, super fellow. The kind of people you want young people to, individuals you want young people to emulate. Super guys. And the best scene, though, takes place prior to the Olympic Games. Both are college-age athletes. They've both sprinters, obviously. Both are undefeated. Never lost a race. And so deep down, being competitors, they just had to know. If there's a race between Little and Abrahams, who's going to win? Who's the fastest? And so they put this track meet together on this particular day in Europe. This was the sporting event to be at. This was the World Series. This was the thing to watch. Came time for the race, 100-meter dash. Best sprinters around were lined up. Who's going to win, Little or Abrahams? They fire the gun. They have the race, and it's Eric Little first, Harold Abraham second. And the next scene goes to an empty track, empty stadium, but for a few people. Track meet's over. Sitting up kind of in the top of this stadium, looking down at that empty track, is Harold Abrahams and a young lady who he would later marry. And he's looking down at that track, and he's replaying this race in his mind over and over again. And every time, it's the same result. Little first, Abraham second. Little first, he's second. And it's driving him nuts because he's never lost. And he's sitting there going through this. The young lady turns to him, and she asks the question, Harold, why the long face? So you lost. You finished second. You've won all the others. What's the big deal? There's a pause, and he turned to her, and he said, I don't run to lose. I run to win. And if I can't win, I'm not going to run. He was going to quit because the pain associated with failing to get to the goal was so intense. He said, I'm just not going to do it. It hurts too much. There was another pause, and she turned back to him and she said it all. If you don't run, you can't win. And that is so true. It is, and it's so important, and it's always been what makes this country great. Americans have always been willing to get out of the stands and run. Americans have always been willing to get off the sidelines and get in the game. Americans have always been willing to not hang out in the shadows, but to get out there in the arena where it counts, fighting for the things that make our nation great. And that's our charge. And so I want to thank you for being here and engaging in that very struggle and making America continue to be the greatest nation in history. Thank you.